Welcome everybody to the back of the ute again. Today I am very excited because never in my wildest imagination when I first started in the back of the ute yarns did I think I was going to get a councillor in the back of the ute. So welcome Jonno.
Hey.
Jonno is councillor of Gabba ward in Brisbane, and he's attracted me or got my attention because of his holistic way of approaching things, and particularly with these gardens and providing food for people and that community spirit. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Shall we start by
Yeah, so I might just acknowledge we're on an area of Brisbane called Kurilpa, and this area was historically a big meeting place for a lot of Aboriginal community groups, and I just wanted to acknowledge the rightful owners of this place, who are the Yagara people and the Turrbal people, and acknowledge their elders past and present. And I think when we're talking about like gardening and land management, it's important to remember that Aboriginal people have been sustainably managing the land for thousands of years, and we shouldn't like obliterate that or pretend that that's just in the past, because a lot of Aboriginal people are still sustainably managing country.
Yeah, I'm so pleased you understand that.
Yeah.
So how did all these gardens start?
Yeah, so I mean, broadly speaking, when the COVID pandemic first hit, there was immediately a lot of panic buying, and it really sort of highlighted what a lot of people have been saying for a long time, which is that our food systems are not very resilient. You could have like a flood or some supply chain disruptions or any number of crises, and suddenly these really long distance food chains where stuff is coming from like the other side of the country or even from overseas, all that breaks down and there's no local produce left. And so I think that pandemic kind of really highlighted what was already a big problem in society, but that was kind of a catalyst for another generation of young activists and urban farmers to get mobilised. And so the community itself, it really wasn't me leading it. It was like local residents started urban farming projects like the one here at the end of Boundary Street, which is just sort of West End Highgate Hill. And this was sort of the first of quite a few projects, and it was sort of a collaborative process where the gardeners were saying, oh, we'd like to set up another one, and then my office was sort of saying, oh, well, there's an empty block of parkland over there, kind of thing. And our office provided a little bit of support, but it was really a lot of volunteer labour and a lot of local residents saying, hey, let's grow more produce locally. And there was a slight difference between these sorts of urban farming projects as opposed to other community gardens. In some ways it's the same stuff. It's like the community coming together, but at least initially there was a really strong emphasis that people like Ruby and Al and the Growing Forward crew placed on producing lots of fresh food fairly quickly. So sometimes community gardens are quite a slow process, but this crew were like, let's just get in there, set up our plots, plant some fast growing veggies, and they're churning out huge volumes, like for an inner city area, like boxes and boxes a week of fresh produce. And yeah, it's really exciting to see that kind of, even like a year and a half since it all started, it's still going strong.
So what makes you so different then? Why I'm not other councillors? Why are you jumping on?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not like other city councils in Brisbane. I'm a member of the Greens, and I think one difference between maybe the Greens and the major political parties is that we're still a little bit more connected to the community, and that varies a bit. But really, the big political parties, they take massive campaign donations from like Woolworths and Coles, and they're very much part of that like big agricultural industrial complex that rips off farmers and rips off workers and rips off consumers just so big companies can make more money. Whereas we're a little bit more critical of that, and we're like, actually food should be freely available to everyone who needs it, and we need to stop thinking of food as a commodity and start thinking of it as a basic human need and basic human right. And so I think kind of my green philosophy influences a little bit of how I approach my role as a councillor. I'm the only Greens councillor in Queensland actually at the moment. So I'm the first, hopefully there'll be more, we'll see. But like there's a lot of other cool independent councillors around as well who also support some of this stuff in different regions around Queensland. But maybe one of the big differences is that we don't always take no for an answer, and we're willing to stand up a little bit against bureaucracy. Because even when you've got, there are some good councillors out there, but even when you have councillors who are genuinely connected to the community and they do care about this stuff, they often don't want to contradict the public servants, or the mayor or the other councillors will be pushing a different agenda. And so maybe they're pushovers, or they don't like want to challenge that power directly, whereas we've been more comfortable saying, no, you're wrong, and we're going to speak out about it, and if you tell us we can't plant a garden here, maybe we'll just do it anyway, that sort of stuff. And yeah.
It's funny because Ruby and Al mentioned that basically they're breaking the law. They've broken the law for 2 years and there has been no recourse on their actions. So how are you actually protecting these gardens? How is it working?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in a way I'm providing some insulation from bureaucracy where, I think the fact that I'm supportive of these gardens is part of the reason that they're still here. But they're also just protected by general community support. And I think the council knows that if they tried to dig up this garden or bulldoze it or whatever, that there'd be hell to pay, and there'd be a lot of activists out here locking onto the bulldozers and that sort of thing. It does expose me a little bit, like there've been some conduct complaints and like official proceedings to try and discipline me. And I mean, they haven't led to much yet, but there's probably an argument to be made that I'm really pushing the envelope in my role as a councillor. And it might be that at some point, like that becomes untenable and they find enough excuses to kick me off council and that sort of thing. So I think that's one thing that a lot of people who are involved in different forms of activism and community building have to be aware of, is that if you're going to challenge systems and fight for a better world, you might lose your job. And that's a hard thing to grapple with, but I guess I'm comfortable with that risk.
Yeah, and you've been in council now for 5 years.
Yeah.
What attracted you to the position?
Yeah, so I mean, I was re-elected in 2020. I was first elected in 2016, and I think one of the main motivations for me to get involved in local government was seeing the negative impacts of gentrification around places like West End. So lots of people getting priced out of the area, rents going up, house prices going up, all this new development happening that's like cutting down trees and choking the neighbourhood, but it's not actually improving housing affordability. So, you know, the developers say, oh yeah, let us build more apartments, that'll make rents cheaper. It never seems to. In fact, the more apartments you approve, the more land values rise, and as land values rise, rents rise, and then everyone gets priced out. So that was one of the big factors that motivated me, but it was also just a broader concern about climate change and global warming and the unsustainable way we're living. And I realised that there's a lot of people out there in the community doing really good stuff, but you also need to have some ways of influencing the mainstream system. And so I kind of see myself as straddling both of those worlds. Like I've got a foot within government, and then there's other half of me sort of out there in the community supporting projects like this. And I think that's been a really interesting experiment to see how actually having some progressive people or radical people in council does actually help get stuff done. And like a few years ago, for example, Brisbane City Council had this sort of general rule that you couldn't plant veggie gardens along the footpaths and the road verges. Whereas now, partly because of our advocacy and partly because of residents and partly because of there's some good people working for council, we got that policy changed. And so now you can plant verge gardens along in front of your house on the public land, and lots of people are doing that. So being able to use the resources of like elected office has also been useful to kind of help change the system and translate that community power into like mainstream or establishment power.
Oh.
Just noticed that. Battery got a bit tired.
I don't know, it might have got a bit hot, but it's not.
I didn't notice exactly when it happened. I only just noticed it then.
That's okay. Well, that's why I've got a second camera.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Still recording?
Adds to the quirkiness of being in the back of the ute. Great. Well, I was going to lead on to... No, it doesn't want to do it, does it? Don't. Just please. The first time you've let me down. It was the other one. So yeah, sorry, I just want to try and lead it on to, has it made a difference for you being holistically minded? Because what I'm seeing with humanity in general is that we are going down these rabbit holes and we're getting stuck. And especially sort of like in council or politics, and then they seem to be headbutting a wall, and then they can't get out of it. They can't admit that they're wrong, or they can't step over whatever they're headbutting. How are you different?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think a lot of sort of more radical councillors and politicians, one of the things they do well is to recognise that everything's connected. All our different food systems and housing systems and transport systems and political systems, they're all interconnected and they all overlap. But that also means that when you're trying to change one thing, there's this whole web of other things that are kind of resisting that change. So even a simple like policy change or some local council decision, if the council changes its position, there's all these flow-on impacts, and that might affect someone else's property values or might affect some developer's interests or whatever. So I guess, recognising that if we want to change one thing, we have to actually be willing to make some bigger systemic changes. Yeah. And I think sometimes people talk about systemic change like tweaking things around the edges. They talk about system change and revolution, but actually what they're arguing for is not revolutionary. And what I think we need is a genuine revolution where we're not just rethinking a bit about our farming system or rethinking a bit about our political system, but we're saying this entire way of life is fundamentally broken and needs to be reevaluated. And that means talking about, even the idea of private land ownership and some of that stuff, and talking about the way that capitalism treats food as a commodity and exploits workers. Like, all of this stuff's interconnected. And so, thinking holistically about the soil and about food systems is important, but also thinking holistically about broader systems, I think, is one of the crucial differences. Because if you're just trying to change farming, or you're just trying to change sustainable food production in isolation, you're going to keep butting up against brick walls. But when you recognise that sustainable farming also connects to like climate change and environmental management, and connects to workers' rights, and connects to health and nutrition, all of that stuff, then you're like, oh, there's a bigger picture here, and we've got to pay attention to the whole picture, not just one little bit of it.
See, isn't it amazing? Yeah, when you mention climate change, all you think about is carbon. You don't think about farming.
Yeah.
Or seaweed. Or
Yeah, totally.
And that was the same with what we've been going through, is that not one person's mentioned health, and that when you do mention health, you get shut down.
Yeah.
No, that wouldn't work. well, it has for thousands and thousands of years.
Yeah.
You then went on to make this Mycelium film. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so Mycelium was basically an attempt to document and share the stories of all this stuff that's already happening in the community, because there are so many amazing local gardening projects and community projects that are happening on the ground, but if you don't tell that story and spread that story, then no one else knows about it. Whereas we wanted to really capture what was happening in this little part of Brisbane and show how easy it is and how possible it is, so that other people would be inspired to try similar stuff in their neighbourhoods. And so Mycelium is kind of like about a 12-minute documentary. It features the various growing forward gardens and the establishment of these new urban farming projects. It also looks at some of the verge gardening projects we've done around the area, because my office used some grant money to buy trees and soil and stuff for about 50 households to plant up new verge gardens in front of their homes. And then we've also put a bit of support into some orchards and some seedling hubs. And the seedling hubs, the Mycelium video talks about them a little bit, but they're really about spreading local seeds and heirloom seedlings and varieties, that where it's not just everyone's buying their seeds from Bunnings. And some farmers will be aware that a lot of big companies basically patent certain seed stocks, and if you want to keep growing that certain strain for that plant, you have to pay licensing fees, etc., back to certain companies. And that whole issue of like intellectual property rights attaching to seeds is really concerning. So the seedling hubs were just a small local way of resisting that, by encouraging people to share seeds and seedlings locally that are maybe organic or that aren't patented, etc. And that, I mean, we could have a whole conversation about resilience, but the video was really about showing how all those projects connect together and celebrating them and kind of giving a platform to those local volunteers who are doing all that great work.
Yeah, I loved it. I've watched it 4 times. I'll
cool.
just continue to watch it, because every time you think, oh, I didn't see that before. There's so much going on. It was so beautifully filmed. It's won awards. And you're right, that's how you spread words. I would not have known who Jonno was. unless I'd seen it, and I was actually at the Backyard Film Festival.
Cool,
It was a
yeah.
really good evening.
Yeah.
Again, another thing that Brisbane did, is that in your ward?
Yeah, I think it's moved around a little bit, but it's been my ward for a couple of years. And yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
Just one last question. Regenerative farming. Had you heard of it before?
Yeah, I had, and regenerative farming is kind of a big thing in Greens political circles. Like, we sort of see that as the future and a much more sustainable alternative to kind of monocultural industrial scale farming. For me, regenerative farming is about putting back into the land more than you take out, and again, thinking holistically about how, you know, it's not just about producing more food and improving soil health for the sake of growing more crops. It's about creating new habitat and spaces for wildlife, ensuring that our insect populations are still healthy, reducing the amount of chemicals we're putting back into the land so that we have a really complex and resilient ecosystem and healthy biodiversity. And I guess I'm really inspired by the ideas of regenerative agriculture and regenerative farming, but we also need to recognise that none of this is new. Like, not just for, like, Indigenous peoples in this continent have been engaging in regenerative farming practices for tens of thousands of years.
Yeah.
And the same is true with a lot of different cultures all over the world.
Yeah.
It's actually just this one kind of narrow Western capitalist culture that's dominant in Australia. We've gone down this road of like extractive, unsustainable farming, whereas heaps of communities and cultures all around the world have been doing this sustainably for years in many different ways. And so regenerative farming is not just like one way of doing things. It's actually like our version of extractive farming and monoculture, industrial farming. That's the one weird, narrow approach. And then there's 1,000 other forms of farming that could all be called regenerative. And yeah, they all have pros and cons and achieve different goals. And it's really cool that more people are thinking about that stuff.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jonno. It's been an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. And I think it's just so great that you're telling more of these stories and that more people are thinking critically about this. So if you're watching this stuff, get active. Actually get out there in your community, whether you live in the inner city or whether you live out in a rural area. Everyone can make a difference and everyone has the ability to positively impact this stuff. So yeah, don't just sit on the couch.
That's right. And if you're a politician or a wannabe, this is the mode and model that you need to follow.
Oh, thanks, Tabs. Cool.
Thank you.
Sick. So you'll be jumping back a bit between the two cameras, I guess?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, my neighbour said, oh, so I don't know who you've got on the cameras, but they flick between the two. I was like, it's me, mate. I'm not, that's not doing the computer.
No, it's one.